It was raining outside, softly drumming on the windows. I always liked this weather, sitting in warmth, sipping coffee, and watching the street. Living on the third floor gave me a good view of what was happening outside. The storm was intensifying, the trees planted in front of the building bending to the rhythm of the wind. An empty trash can rolled down the sidewalk, and a girl was running down the street, trying to find shelter from the raging elements. Suddenly, my attention was drawn to a car that stopped at the entrance. It was the postman. A man quickly jumped out of the car and ran to the building. After a while, the intercom rang. It meant he was here for me. I opened the door, and soon the postman came up to me, handing me a letter marked, "To be delivered in person." I signed for it, and closing the door, began to open the envelope. I was curious to know who it was from. Expecting a long letter, I unfolded the sheet and saw only a few words. "Forgive me, George, please survive, and remember it must be yellow." That was all that was written. I turned the sheet but found nothing else. On the edge of the paper, I noticed red stains like drops of blood. The handwriting was sloppy, as if someone had written it in a hurry. What could it mean? I examined the envelope and saw the sender's name written in small handwriting. My heart pounded with excitement. Ethan Miller. That was my late father. He died 20 years ago when I was 10. My mother died in childbirth, so he was the only relative I remembered. After his death, I was sent to an orphanage. And now, after all these years, I receive a letter from him with such an ambiguous message. I walked to the fireplace where our only family photograph stood. Picking it up, I saw a 29-year-old man with curly black hair, smiling happily next to a boy who looked a lot like him. I brought the photo closer and looked at my father's expression. It seemed to me that behind his smile he hid sadness. Strange. I hadn't noticed this before. He died falling from the 10th floor, smashing to death. At least that's what they thought at first. The cause of death was recorded as suicide, but the doctor who performed the autopsy concluded that he died before hitting the ground. The case was reclassified, and investigators began searching for a killer, but never found one. It was one of those unsolved mysteries that later become legends. The apartment was locked. There were no signs of forced entry. No witnesses were found. There were also no other traces. No fingerprints, no DNA of the suspect. When I grew up, I took up the case again, digging through the archives to find the truth, even hiring detectives, but found nothing. No matter how hard I searched, it was getting dark. Tomorrow would be October 3rd, my birthday. I would turn 30, the age at which my father died. After reaching adulthood, I inherited his property. I was surprised to learn that I was wealthy, so I had no problem supporting my life. Only two things tormented me: loneliness and the mystery of my father's death. The rooms darkened, but I didn't bother turning on the light, lost in thought. Soon, fatigue took over, and after hiding the letter in a drawer, I took a shower and went to bed. I woke up to a loud knock. Sitting up, I turned on the lamp and looked around. What could it be? An antique clock ticked on the wall. The wind howled outside. Putting on slippers and wrapping myself in a robe, I wandered through the dimly lit apartment. The noise was coming from the kitchen. Carefully opening the door, I peeked inside and saw that the window was wide open and banging against the frame from the wind. I hurried to close it. The wind had blown rain into the room, wetting the floor. I trudged to the closet for the mop, which was in the hallway. Just as I almost reached it, the light flickered and went out, probably due to the storm. I cursed and turned on the flashlight on my phone, deciding to finish the task. I opened the closet door and froze in shock. Usually the closet was 5 feet long and wide. enough for buckets, boxes, and other household items. But now, before me was a long corridor, lit by a dim red light. I felt uneasy. Am I still dreaming? I thought. I closed the closet door and immediately opened it again. The corridor hadn't gone anywhere. What was this? I took a step inside and felt a change. Looking back, I tried to understand what had happened. Suddenly it dawned on me. All sounds had disappeared. The ticking clock, the wind outside. It was as if I had entered a vacuum. This made me uneasy, and I stepped back. All the sounds returned. I was astonished by this phenomenon. I stood for a while, staring into the void and trying to gather my thoughts. It seemed like I was still dreaming. But the vision didn't go away, and soon curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside and walked along the smooth floor, laid with black tiles. At the end of the corridor, I saw 3 red doors. They were numbered. 1, 2, 3. I inspected each and decided to open door number 3, but it was locked. Then I tugged at the handle of door number 2. The same thing happened. With no hope left, I pulled the handle of the first door. It gave way. Opening the door, I saw a white light, and suddenly some force sucked me in. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was clearly not in the apartment. It was a small clearing in the middle of the forest. Wherever you looked, trees were everywhere. Looking around, I noticed 2 more people nearby who looked as shocked as I was. Closest to me was a red-haired man about my age, sitting on the grass, dressed in a white t-shirt and jeans. A little further away stood a tall, beautiful blonde, dressed in hiking clothes. A backpack hung behind her, making it seem like she was ready for a mountain hike. She was looking around, then glanced at me, and I saw her eyebrow raise. I looked down at myself and realized I was only in a robe. I felt uncomfortable. But then I remembered where I was and thought it was a dream. I tried to pinch my cheek and felt pain. Damn, I wasn't dreaming. The logical question escaped my lips. Where am I and who are you? I looked at the strangers, but they were just as confused. The man got up, dusting off his pants, then pointed a finger at me and poked me in the shoulder as if checking if I was a ghost. After which he said, "Seems real." Then he apologized and stepped back. I then asked, "Did you also get here through a mysterious door?" They nodded. Yes, that's how it was. None of us knew what had happened. At least the man and I didn't. I looked at the girl, and it seemed to me that she knew something, but was hiding it. The man extended his hand to me and said, "My name is Tom. I'm from North Tarrytown, New York." I shook his hand and replied, "My name is George. I'm from Bellevue, Washington." After we introduced ourselves, we turned to the girl. She reluctantly said, "My name is Sarah. I'm from New York." I noticed she kept looking around as if she was afraid of something. After we got acquainted, we began to examine the place where we ended up. There was a forest all around, but in one direction, there was a small path. I approached the trees and saw that a little further, the forest was completely engulfed in fog. It seemed like we were surrounded by it. Tom came up to me, and seeing the fog, exclaimed, "What the hell is this?" He wanted to go check it out, but Sarah called out to him, "Wait, don't go there." Tom stopped abruptly and turned, asking, "Why not?" "Who knows what might be there?" the girl replied. "Let's go along the path instead." I was convinced again that she knew something and tried to extract information from her, but she wouldn't answer. She just turned away, adjusted her backpack, and walked down the path. We had no choice but to follow her. The path led us deeper into the forest, and with each step, the atmosphere grew darker. The trees stood close, their branches intertwining as if trying to grasp us. A light breeze rustled the leaves, creating eerie sounds. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and dry branches cracked underfoot. We walked in silence, each lost in our thoughts. Sarah walked ahead, confidently leading the way. Tom looked around as if expecting an attack. I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was far more sinister than it seemed at first glance. Suddenly the path emerged into a small clearing, and in front of us appeared a house. Its walls were made of dark wood, the roof covered with red tiles. Flowers grew around the house and lanterns hung on the sides. The house looked so cozy and unassuming that it seemed out of place in such a gloomy forest. A small porch invited us to enter, and lazy smoke was drifting from the chimney. The windows were draped with light curtains, creating a sense of coziness and warmth. On the door hung a sign that read, "Welcome." "It looks safe," Tom said, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. We knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a middle-aged woman opened it. She was short, with gray strands in her chestnut hair, gathered in a bun. Her face, soft and friendly, was adorned with deep wrinkles, as if she had laughed a lot in her life. She wore a simple dress and an apron stained with flour. "Oh, finally," she said with a kind smile. "Rosa's friends have arrived. She's been expecting you. Come in, don't be shy." We exchanged puzzled looks but followed her inside. The room we entered was cozy and warm. The floor was carpeted, the walls adorned with pictures of forests and animals. A fireplace crackled quietly in the corner, and the air was filled with the pleasant smell of fresh baking and herbs. "Have a seat," the woman said, pointing to a large wooden table in the center of the room. We sat down, and she continued bustling about as if she had known us all her life, and didn't even pay attention to the fact that I was in a robe. "And here is Rosa," she said. A girl of about 16 entered the room. She had long blonde hair braided into a plait and big blue eyes that studied us attentively. She was dressed in a simple dress. "Hello," Rosa said softly, sitting down next to us. Her voice was gentle and melodious. When she sat down, the hostess began serving dishes. Various treats appeared on the table: steaming meat pies, fresh bread, pickled vegetables, and fragrant herbs. We looked at it all, trying to understand what was happening. I decided to ask, "Ma'am, could you tell us where we are?" She looked at me in surprise and said, "Why, in the forest, of course." "But what forest? What state? What country?" I quickly asked. The woman began to get annoyed and replied angrily, "What are you talking about? The forest is the forest, and there is nothing else." She then irritably left the room. I exchanged glances with my companions, who also had puzzled faces. At that moment we noticed that Rosa had started eating and was humming to herself. I thought about joining in the meal and reached for a roll, but saw that Sarah hadn't touched anything. Tom, on the other hand, was devouring the food, stuffing his cheeks full. It seemed to be in his character to act according to the situation, and he was clearly hungry now. Soon the hostess returned, cheerful and happy again, as if nothing had happened. She carried a pot from which steam and a pleasant smell of soup were rising. "Why aren't you eating?" she asked, ladling the soup into cups. I didn't answer, nor did Sarah. Tom continued eating, praising the food as very tasty. The hostess placed the pot on the table and distributed the cups, then asked, "Who wants some delicious soup?" Sarah and I refused, but Tom agreed. As the hostess ladled it into the cups, an appetizing smell spread through the room, and my stomach growled. Tom took a spoonful, tasted it, and said, "Incredibly tasty." We watched him in amazement. It seemed he had lost his head over the food. I became curious about what kind of soup it was, and I peeked inside. Seeing what was floating there, I fell to the floor in horror, almost vomiting, and my limbs went numb with fear. Everyone stared at me, trying to understand what had happened. I just pointed a finger at the pot, stuttering, "Take a look for yourselves." When Tom and Sarah stood and looked, they both had the same reaction. They covered their mouths and ran outside. The sound of vomiting came from outside. It was probably Tom. The thing was, a boiled human finger was floating in the soup. I was overcome with horror. Where had we ended up? Was this a family of cannibals? I looked at the hostess, who shook her head and said, "Young people these days, their stomachs are so weak." She then ladled out more soup for her daughter, who was eating voraciously and paid no attention to us. I jumped up and ran outside. Tom was still on his knees, hands on the grass, trying to vomit everything he had eaten. Rosa stood nearby with a pale face. I approached her with trembling legs and said, "We need to run." I kept looking around, fearing an attack at any moment. Just as I wanted to help Tom up, Sarah grabbed my arm and said, "We can't leave." This made me angry. Approaching her closely, I almost shouted, "If you know something, then speak." She stepped back, a bit frightened, and said, Okay, I'll tell you later, but only in private. Strange that you don't know about this place." I nodded in satisfaction, and Tom, who seemed to have regained his composure, approached us. He cursed for a long time, and honestly, I had never heard such swearing. Finally, he calmed down and said, "What was that?" We were silent, as we didn't know either. I thought it was best for us to get out of there as soon as possible. Just as this thought crossed my mind, the front door opened, and the hostess and her daughter stepped out. Seeing them, I wanted to run, but seeing Sarah remain calm, I decided to see what would happen next. The woman kissed her daughter on the forehead and said, "Well, you've eaten? Now go visit Grandma and take her some pies." Then she pulled out a red-hooded cloak and put it on the girl, handing her a wicker basket filled with steaming pies. Rosa bowed and said, "Okay, Mama." Then they both looked at us, and the hostess added, "If you're going together, help Rosa," the woman said, pointing to 3 baskets beside her. We stood in indecision, unsure whether to run away or obey her. Then Sarah stepped forward and took one of the baskets, so I followed her lead. Last was Tom, who hadn't forgotten about the finger and stood, not understanding why we were doing this. But then he also took a basket, trying to stay as far from the hostess as possible. The woman waved her hand. "Go." The girl skipped down the path cheerfully, and we had no choice but to follow her. The further we went, the deeper we got into the forest. The branches of the trees intertwined above our heads, creating a dark canopy through which only a few rays of the sun could penetrate. The air was damp and cool, smelling of rotting leaves and moss. Branches cracked underfoot, and every rustle made me flinch. The forest looked eerie. Tall trees with crooked branches which seemed almost alive surrounded us on all sides. The fog enveloping the path made the atmosphere even more sinister. It seemed that behind every tree something evil was watching us. The branches seemed to stretch out their gnarled fingers, trying to grab us. Rosa walked ahead, cheerfully skipping and humming a tune that echoed through the silent forest. Sometimes she stopped to pick a flower or admire a plant. The whole situation reminded me of an old fairy tale, which made it even scarier. We couldn't understand what was happening, and this sense of uncertainty was oppressive. "How much further do we have to go?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. "Not much farther," Rosa replied without looking back. At one of these stops, Tom decided to take a bathroom break. He stepped off the path behind some trees, and I took the opportunity to interrogate Sarah. Approaching her, I whispered, "Tell me what's going on here," I said, trying to stay calm. Sarah looked at me, sighed, and said, "Today is your birthday, right?" I nodded, confirming her words. She continued, "Today is also my birthday, and I turned 30, specifically December 24th. If you ask Tom, he'll probably tell you he turned 30 as well." I interrupted her. "Wait, you said December 24th, but today is October 3rd. You must be mistaken." She shook her head. "I don't know how it works, but when you turn 30, doors appear. And then something happens with time. It doesn't matter what date you were born. If you share the same year, it throws everyone here at the same time on your birthday. And if you don't open one of the doors, you die. So it's good that you went through it. At least you have some chance." "Wait," I tried to understand. "Why are we the ones getting thrown through these doors?" "At first, I couldn't understand why you didn't know, but I realized I was foolish," she replied. "Your relatives must have died, right?" I nodded in agreement. "Sorry," she said. "Probably one of your relatives couldn't pass the trial and died here. My father passed it, so he knew what awaited me and could prepare me. The thing is, someone in your lineage received a mark, or rather, a curse that is passed down through generations. You must have a birthmark in the shape of a star." She rolled up her sleeve and showed a birthmark on the back of her hand. It surprised me because I had a similar one. I lifted my robe and showed my birthmark on my thigh. We looked at each other, feeling a strange sensation as if we were marked like cattle for slaughter. Sarah continued, "We have a chance to survive. We need to follow the script and go through 3 doors. Now it seems we are going through the story of Little Red Riding Hood, and we need to follow her and look for clues. Otherwise, it's the end for us." I listened to her, trying to gather my thoughts, then asked, "But why don't you want to tell Tom?" "I don't trust him yet," she replied. "Sometimes they infiltrate our ranks." She abruptly fell silent as Tom approached us. We continued on our way, Rosa leading, and we tried to stay a little behind her. Sarah went first, constantly looking around, followed by Tom, who had recovered, and I brought up the rear, pondering Sarah's earlier words. So my father died in this place. But what are these doors? And why didn't he tell me more, leaving only a note with apologies and an unclear message? Apparently this place is really dangerous. I glanced around and saw thick fog behind the trees. It reminded me of those corridor games where the character has no freedom of action and has to follow the script. This world was like a game, only a nightmare game. As I walked, thinking about this place, I suddenly bumped into Tom's shoulder, who had stopped abruptly. I didn't understand what had happened and looked ahead. Rosa had suddenly stopped and seemed to be waiting for something. I felt like someone was watching us. We immediately started looking around for danger. It seemed to get darker around us. Somewhere in the fog, we heard the crunch of branches and loud footsteps. Then a growl and heavy breathing came from the same direction. Suddenly, a terrifying creature emerged from the forest. It moved on 2 legs like a giant ape. But it was a wolf, more accurately, a werewolf. It was a couple of feet taller than a human. Its muscular body was covered in thick gray fur, its claws long and sharp, and its eyes glowed yellow. It had a gruesome grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It looked at us, smiling as if it saw defenseless lambs, and came closer. I wanted to run, but I stayed in place. Fear paralyzed me. The monster approached even closer so that we felt its foul breath. It looked us over, still grinning. Then it spoke to the girl in the red cloak. "Girl, what's your name?" It had a deep, very low voice, as if speaking from the abyss, which made it even more terrifying. "Rosa," she replied, and it seemed she wasn't afraid of it at all. I saw Tom's legs trembling. I almost soiled myself, but I remembered I was in a robe, and I almost burst into hysterical laughter. But I was too scared to move, too scared to draw attention to myself. It was an instinctive fear, where you fear making any move. This creature was so terrifying it was hard to describe. The wolf looked us over, eyeing our baskets. Then the girl said, "We're going to Grandma's." The creature nodded and left us. After it was gone, the forest seemed to regain its usual colors. It was like a hallucination. As soon as it was out of sight, I collapsed to the ground. Tom turned to me and whispered, "What the hell was that thing?" Sarah's face was pale. Even though she was prepared for such things, seeing it in reality was an entirely different experience. It felt like our lives were hanging by a thread. That creature inspired fear and helplessness. We sat there for a while until Sarah said we needed to get up since the girl had started moving again. We got up and followed Rosa. The forest became even more eerie. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to form sinister shapes. The fog lay low to the ground, making it damp and slippery. It seemed as though the shadows behind each tree were coming to life and watching us. Every step echoed loudly, breaking the terrifying silence. Soon we came upon a clearing and saw a house. It was a large two-story building, clearly old, with dark wooden walls and a sloped roof covered in shingles. It looked grim and mysterious, as if it had stepped out of the pages of an old fairy tale. Thick bushes and trees grew around the house, giving it an even more sinister appearance. "Is this Grandma's house?" Tom whispered, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. I looked around. The wolf was nowhere in sight, but looking up, I noticed movement on the second floor. According to the fairy tale, he should have already eaten Grandma and was pretending to be her. We needed to do something. Rosa headed towards the house, and Tom suddenly jumped in front of her, trying to stop her. "Don't go in there, Rosa!" he exclaimed, blocking her path. But the girl resisted, starting to get nervous. Breaking free, she ran to the house and knocked on the door. There was no answer for a while, but then a melodic voice called out, "You may come in." There was something off about that voice. The girl opened the door and went inside. We followed her, with Sarah raising her hand to signal us to be ready for anything. We stepped into a dark corridor, lit only by the dim light of old lamps. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, and the floor had worn carpets, muffling our footsteps. We moved cautiously, trying not to make any noise. Rosa confidently headed towards the kitchen, and we followed her. When we entered the kitchen, we saw Grandma. She was sitting at the table, wrapped in a warm blanket, smiling. Her face was wrinkled, and her eyes glowed with warmth. But something about her appearance seemed unnatural. "Put the baskets on the table," Grandma said in a strange, piercing voice. We did as instructed. Then Rosa sat beside her and started chatting. The old woman's voice was strange, too melodic and cold. I couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. Sarah leaned over to me and whispered, "Let's look around. We need to find a door and a key." We left the kitchen and began to explore the house, trying not to attract attention. Rosa and Grandma continued talking, their voices echoing through the house like a creepy refrain. The first room we checked was the living room. The floors creaked underfoot, and the furniture looked old and worn. In the corner stood an old piano, covered in dust, its keys seeming ready to play by themselves. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of stern-faced people, their eyes following our every move. In the corner, an old gramophone flickered, as if ready to play a haunting melody at any moment. We moved further and entered the next room, which turned out to be a bedroom. An old quilt lay on the bed, and above it hung a wooden cross. The windows were draped with heavy curtains, casting the room into semi-darkness. Each creak of the floorboards sent chills down my spine. In the dining room, everything looked surprisingly normal, except for the sinister feeling that lingered in the air. The table was covered with a white cloth, and old porcelain plates stood on it. A row of candles on the mantel created a play of shadows on the walls. We climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor. The steps trembled under our feet, and with each step the tension grew. The second floor was even more eerie. Weak light from the windows struggled to penetrate through thick layers of cobwebs, forcing us to navigate through dense darkness. Suddenly, we smelled it. The smell of blood, strong and heavy. I stopped, and everyone else froze, realizing that something terrible was happening. We slowly moved forward down the corridor, feeling cold sweat on our foreheads. The corridor seemed endless, its walls covered with darkened wallpaper, making it seem like we were surrounded by shadows. At the end of the corridor, we noticed something horrifying. Blood was seeping from under one of the doors. The dark red liquid spread across the floor, forming gruesome patterns. We approached, and the smell of blood became unbearable. The door was slightly ajar, and muffled sounds like someone whispering prayers came from within. Tom, gathering his courage, pushed the door open, and we saw a horrifying scene. It was an empty room, but iron hooks were fixed to the ceiling and human bodies were hung from them. The problem was that they were skinned. I didn't recognize the others, but among them, I saw the silhouette of Rose's grandmother. I almost threw up, but Sarah couldn't hold back and ran out into the corridor. I wanted to scream in horror and run out of there, but we were trapped in this space and had to do something. So I forced myself to search the room for keys or a door. The bloody traces on the floor and the horrifying sight in front of me made it hard to concentrate, but I kept looking. Every corner, every item seemed filled with a nightmare that couldn't be ignored. But in the end, I found nothing. Leaving the room, I met Tom and Sarah, who still looked shocked. We decided to check the other rooms on the second floor. The corridor still seemed endless, its walls covered with faded wallpaper, and the floors creaked under our steps. The first room we checked was an empty bedroom with abandoned furniture and tattered curtains. The second room was a study, with bookshelves filled with old books and a desk covered in dust. There were no keys or doors in any of the rooms that could save us. Then, looking out the window, I saw a small shed in the backyard. It looked old and abandoned, but it was our only hope. "Down there," I said, pointing to the shed. "Maybe there's something in there." Tom nodded, and we hurried down the creaky stairs, passing through the dark and eerie rooms of the first floor again. Once outside, we headed for the shed. The wind blew cold mist, creating an even more ominous atmosphere. We entered the shed and looked around. Inside was dim, and beams of light penetrated through the gaps in the walls, illuminating old tools and dusty boxes. In the corner, I noticed a large pile of bloodied clothes. They probably belonged to the wolf's victims. The sight of the gruesome pile sent chills down my spine and thoughts of the terrible events that had happened here. Axes hung on the walls, which probably belonged to the woodcutters. I remembered that they were the ones who defeated the wolf in the fairy tale. But here they were already dead. What should we do? Suddenly we heard a piercing scream. It was Rosa. Tom was about to rush to her, but Sarah grabbed his hand and said, "Wait, don't rush. It could be a trap." We started to think about what to do next. I looked around the shed again, and seeing the axes, decided to arm myself. They weren't here for no reason. I approached one and picked it up. It was heavy, with a wide blade that seemed made more for chopping heads than wood. I tried to swing it, but it came out crooked. I needed to practice. The others also took one each, and we decided to go back to the house and see what was happening. There were no other options. We could try to venture into the fog and see what was there. But by all game genres, there would only be death waiting for us there. We stepped out of the shed, and Sarah said, "We've searched everything and found neither a key nor a door. It looks like we have to somehow fight this creature. We'll act according to the situation. Maybe we'll die, or maybe we'll get lucky. In any case, try to survive." Her words made me recall my father's note. Survive. This gave me a bit more resolve. We carefully moved toward the house, trying not to make any unnecessary noise. We approached the entrance, listening for any sound, but it was silent, an unnatural silence. As I climbed the porch steps, it seemed that the creaking echoed throughout the area. It was driving me mad. I was afraid that the creature would jump out at the sound. I opened the door and stepped in, with the others following me. The silence in the house was only broken by the ticking of a wall clock in the hallway. I glanced at it and saw that the hands on the old clock face were moving backward. I cursed under my breath. What the hell is going on? We moved further and once again smelled the scent of blood. As we walked towards the kitchen, we saw bloody paw prints leading from it and down the corridor. It was that creature. I slowly peeked into the kitchen and saw it was covered in blood. The sight made me freeze. Tom nudged me on the shoulder, asking what was happening. When he looked in, he whistled quietly. There was no body, but the whole room was splattered with blood, as if a blood bomb had gone off. The stench was awful. I scanned the room but found no clues. Turning to the others, I whispered, "Let's follow the tracks." They nodded silently, their faces pale. It was clear that no one wanted to go, but there was no other choice. The tracks on the carpet led to a bedroom. As I approached the door, I listened and heard loud, raspy breathing, like that of a huge, heavy creature. I reached for the handle, praying not to die instantly, and quietly turned it. Opening the door, I saw that the bedroom was in semi-darkness. The werewolf wasn't there, but on the bed lay Grandma, smiling at us. Seeing our reluctance to enter, she invited us in with a melodic, unnatural voice. I stood in indecision. The atmosphere was incredibly creepy, with a foul smell in the air, like that of mice and unwashed socks. Grandma kept her eyes on us, smiling her eerie smile, and beckoned us with a finger. It seemed her patience was wearing thin. I hid the axe behind my back and took a step forward, then another, slowly approaching her. Each step was a struggle, like crossing a mile. Suddenly I noticed something strange. Under the bed was a door. Previously, when we had searched this room, it wasn't there. Now I saw it embedded in the floor, right under the bed. There was a handle and a keyhole on the side, and the door was red. I crouched a bit and saw the number 2 in the middle. We had found it. I turned my head and nodded toward the door. Sarah squinted and her eyes lit up. She nodded back, signaling for me to proceed. I cautiously approached the lying Grandma, about an arm's length away. She didn't take her eyes off me, strangely ignoring the others, and with a smile she asked, "Don't you have anything to ask me?" I was confused. What did she want? Then I asked her, "What exactly do you want?" She reacted to my question with a malicious grimace that instantly appeared on her face. It was so unnatural it gave me the chills. But she quickly replaced her anger with a smile and said, "For example, why do I have such big ears?" Her words puzzled me, and I looked at her ears sticking out from under her cap. They seemed perfectly normal. I was about to say so, but then I remembered the fairy tale and realized what I had to do. "Oh, Grandma, why do you have such big ears?" I asked. "So I can hear you better," she answered with a satisfied voice. It was clear she wanted me to continue asking. Her eyes lit up with anticipation, and she even lifted herself a bit. So I continued, "Oh, Grandma, why do you have such big eyes?" "So I can see you better." "Oh, Grandma, why do you have such big hands?" "So I can hug you easier." I asked the questions quickly and got quick answers. Only one question remained. I knew that after it she would attack. My heart was trembling, and my hands nervously gripped the axe. I glanced at the others and saw they were ready. Sarah winked at me. So I turned to Grandma and said, "Oh, Grandma, what big?" I didn't finish the question, because Sarah leaped forward with her axe raised and struck Grandma's neck. Everything happened very quickly. The head detached from the body and rolled across the floor, shrieking in fury. The body jumped up and started flailing its arms wildly. I stepped back, afraid of getting hit. Suddenly I saw a chain with a key hanging from her severed neck. My heart raced with joy. This was the key we needed. Then, with a swing of my axe, I cut the chain. It snapped, and the key fell to the floor. Seeing this, Sarah shouted, "Grab it quickly!" I dove to the floor, dodging the flailing body. The head continued to shriek loudly. Grabbing the key, I rushed to the door. Glancing at the scene in the room, I saw the body and head growing, transforming into the creature. Tom yelled, "Hurry!" and began chopping at the creature with his axe, distracting it from me. I tried to insert the key into the keyhole. With trembling hands, I finally turned it. The door creaked open inward, and a bright white light poured out. I shouted, "It's ready!" and then joined Tom in chopping at the creature with my axe. I yelled for Sarah to jump first. She didn't hesitate and dove under the bed, disappearing into the bright light. The creature took advantage of the moment when we were distracted and struck Tom, sending him flying against the wall, knocking him unconscious. I rushed to him. The body moved towards the head. Dropping my axe, I grabbed Tom and dragged him to the door. Finally getting him there, I shoved him through the opening. Then I was about to jump after him, but the creature grabbed me by the edge of my robe and started pulling me back. It had somehow reattached its head. Fueled by adrenaline, I slipped out of the robe and, in just my underwear, dived headfirst through the opening. I heard an enraged roar behind me, then felt a pulling force and lost consciousness. I awoke on a cold stone floor, covered by a thin cloak. Sarah was sitting next to me. She was relieved to see I was awake and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer, just got up, realizing we were in a stone corridor. Am I in a castle? I wondered. I finally stood up, feeling a bit dizzy. Sarah steadied me, and gradually I regained my bearings. I looked around. This place indeed resembled a medieval castle. Torches burned on the walls, and banners with the emblem of a man with a severed head hung. This alarmed me. Where had we ended up this time? Suddenly I heard footsteps and turned to see Thomas waving at me cheerfully. Beside him walked a man who looked like a medieval butler. He was a tall, lean man with sharp features. His face was deeply lined with wrinkles, and his eyes were cold and piercing. He wore a black tailcoat, complemented by a white shirt and a bow tie. His gray hair was combed back, giving him a stern appearance. "Man, thanks for saving me." Thomas patted me on the shoulder, smiling gratefully. I felt awkward and mumbled something about how anyone would have done the same. Then the butler spoke, drawing all our attention to him. He bowed and said, "Dear guests, please follow me. The master is waiting for you." We exchanged wary glances and decided to follow him. The butler led us through the castle corridors, their walls adorned with ancient tapestries and paintings depicting scenes of hunting and battles. The floors were laid with marble, and our footsteps echoed in the silence. Finally, we arrived at a large door. The butler knocked, and we entered. Inside, I was struck by the grandeur of the room. It was decorated for a celebration. Garlands and floral arrangements hung on the walls, and the ceiling was covered with frescoes depicting scenes of feasts and festivities. In the center of the room stood an enormous table, laden with various dishes: roasted meat, stewed game, fresh fruits and vegetables, bread and cheeses. The dishes were garnished with herbs and set on golden stands. Candles on the table created a cozy light, reflecting off the silver tableware. 2 people were seated at the table, a man with a blue beard looking menacing, and a woman with a pale face and thin hair. The man was large, his eyes gleamed coldly, and his smile was sinister. He wore a luxurious suit that highlighted his status and wealth. The woman looked no less eerie. Her face was ghostly pale, and her thin hair hung down, reminiscent of the girl from The Ring. Her eyes were empty, and she sat motionless like a wax figure. The man laughed continuously and, standing up, invited us to the table. We sat down, trying not to show our fear. I was still in just my underwear, covered only by a thin cloak that Sarah had apparently given me. Seeing all the food, I remembered I hadn't eaten in a while and was very hungry. I decided to eat, but then recalled the old woman's soup and swore not to touch the meat dishes. We ate, trying not to attract attention, while the man with the blue beard continued to laugh and talk to his wife, trying to cheer her up. But she sat as if attending a wake. He finally lost his temper, jumped up, and slammed the table. It split in half, spilling all the food on the floor, and we barely managed to jump back. "Can you smile at least once, even on your wedding day?" he shouted, but she remained with the same expression. It was clear the man had given up. Turning to us, he said, "Tomorrow I leave and ask you to look after my wife in the castle. Here are the keys." He took out a large bunch of keys and added, "There is one door you must not open. If you do, you won't keep your heads. Now go, you may rest." With that, he headed to the back door of the hall and left. We exchanged frightened glances, and Sarah whispered, "This is the tale of Bluebeard." I didn't know it, so she briefly told me that in the original story the husband left, forbidding his wife to enter one room, but she disobeyed and was killed. We listened to her silently. I approached the throne and took the bunch of keys. Sorting through them, I noticed one familiar key, the same one that opened the second door. Could it be we had the key already? I showed the bunch to the others, and they were delighted. Soon the butler approached us and led us to our rooms. We decided to explore the castle tomorrow when Bluebeard left. We had the key, we just needed to find the door. The butler led us through the long castle corridors. Every step echoed in the silence. "Here are your rooms," he said, pointing to 3 doors. Each of us received our own bedroom. I entered mine and looked around. It was a spacious room with a high ceiling. Tapestries depicting knightly tournaments hung on the walls. In the center of the room stood a large canopy bed covered with a dark red bedspread. Beside the bed stood a carved wooden table with a silver candelabrum, on which candles were burning. On a chair by the wall, I found a set of clothes. Finally, I could change out of my underwear and thin cloak. The clothes were old-fashioned but clean and comfortable. I put them on and felt a bit better. Fatigue took over. I lay on the bed, feeling the weight of the day close my eyelids. The candles burned with a soft light, creating a cozy atmosphere. Before I could think about what awaited us tomorrow, sleep already took me, and I fell into a deep slumber. I woke up to a strange sound. Someone was banging on the wall in the adjacent room. My room was the last one, and I couldn't understand who it could be. The sound kept me from sleeping, so I decided to get up and check what was happening. Carefully opening the door, trying not to make any noise, I peeked into the corridor. It was empty. Seeing the neighboring door, I decided to check it out. But as soon as I left my room and closed the door, I saw Bluebeard's wife standing behind it. I was so scared I jumped. She stood silently, staring at me without any reaction. I tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. I thought about going back to my room, but the banging disturbed me, so I ignored the strange woman and went to the neighboring door. I knocked softly, but no one answered. Then I turned the handle, and to my surprise, the door opened. Inside was a small bedroom. In the corner, a single candle burned, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room was furnished with old furniture, chairs, sofas. People were sitting on them, or so I initially thought. I was about to apologize and leave, but noticed they weren't moving at all. On closer inspection, I realized they were not people, but life-sized dolls. I decided to enter and see who or what was banging on my wall. Walking to the center of the room, I saw dents in the wall, as if someone had been hitting it with a hammer. What the heck? I looked around but saw no one. Then I decided to leave. It was too creepy here. As I passed by the sofa, I suddenly felt someone grab my hand. I was terrified, and turning, saw it was one of the dolls. My heart stopped, and then started pounding twice as hard. The doll was cold to the touch, its glassy eyes staring lifelessly at me. I began to struggle, but suddenly all the dolls turned their heads towards me. Bloody tears flowed from their eyes. The sight paralyzed me with fear. Trying not to scream, I struggled to free myself from the doll's grip. Finally, with great effort, I broke free. I dashed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Luckily, no one followed me. Hurrying back to my room, I avoided Bluebeard's wife, who was still standing in the corridor watching me. Her gaze was disturbingly empty. I quickly entered my room, locked the door, and leaned against it, trying to calm my breathing. My mind raced to comprehend what was happening. I sat on the bed and listened to the sounds. The banging had stopped, but in the silence I felt that this nightmare was far from over. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. I was scared, but it was Sarah who entered the room. She asked, "Can I stay with you tonight? It's really scary and creepy to be alone." I didn't mind, and she approached and lay down on the other side of the bed. We started talking. I told her what had happened and asked if she had seen Bluebeard's wife. She was surprised and said no, she hadn't. I was glad she was gone. Then, turning to her, I asked, "Why didn't you go to Thomas?" "I still don't trust him," she replied. "Why?" I asked, but she didn't answer. After chatting for a while, we decided to sleep. I didn't notice when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, I saw that Sarah was still sound asleep, hugging me. My heart raced at the sight of such a beauty. I gently woke her, and when she opened her eyes and realized she was hugging me, she blushed, got up abruptly, and left. After I washed up and took care of my needs, we gathered in the corridor. I held the bunch of keys, and now our task was to find the right door. We started walking through the castle, opening doors with the keys. We mostly found ordinary rooms, bedrooms, living rooms, a library. But soon, we found something horrifying. Walking down the corridor, we came across another door, richly decorated. It was locked. I picked one of the keys and the lock clicked. Opening the door, I carefully stepped inside and looked around. It was a small bedroom. A girl sat by the mirror, her back to us, knitting something. Next to her was a spinning wheel. I looked around but didn't find the door we needed and was about to leave when the girl turned to us. I nearly screamed in fright. The girl was covered in scars, as if someone had chopped her up and then stitched her back together. The stitches were still visible on her body. Blood tears flowed from her eyes. She suddenly opened her mouth, and I expected a scream, but there was none. She opened and closed her mouth like a fish, but couldn't make a sound. Sarah pulled me by the hand, leading me to the exit. We slammed the door shut, trying to catch our breath. We entered a few more doors, each of which turned out to be a real nightmare. One of them was a kitchen. I pushed the door open, and a sharp smell of burning met us. The room was furnished with old furniture. The tables and shelves were covered with dust and soot. On the stove stood old, rusty pots, with steam rising from them. In the center of the room stood a cook. Her skin was terribly scalded, red and white spots covering her face and hands. She stood by the stove, leaning over a cauldron. Blood tears mixed with sweat dripped to the floor. Her mouth was slightly open, emitting incoherent sounds as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt cold sweat trickling down my back. Every breath, every movement she made seemed unnatural and creepy. She turned and looked at us. Her eyes were full of pain and despair. Sarah stood next to me, her face as pale as chalk. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "We need to leave." Tom stood behind us, shifting nervously and constantly urging us to hurry up and leave. We slowly retreated, trying not to make sudden moves. The cook continued to watch us, her gaze following us until we closed the door. When the door shut, I felt my body shudder with fear. Gathering our courage, we continued searching and stumbled upon another door. Behind it was a strange garden. The humid air enveloped us, and dew clung to every blade of grass, every bush and tree. The garden seemed alive but gloomy and oppressive. In the center of the garden, among the damp greenery, a girl was working. She was soaking wet, water dripping from her clothes and hair. Her skin had a bluish tint as if she had spent a long time underwater. Blood tears streamed from her eyes, leaving ghastly trails on her cheeks. She tried to say something, but only hoarse sounds and water came from her mouth. My heart tightened with horror. My legs felt weak, and my hands trembled. Thoughts of what had happened to these women wouldn't leave my mind. I tried to pull myself together, but each step in this garden felt agonizingly long. The girl in the garden continued to try to scream, but couldn't make a sound. Her blood tears flowed continuously, adding to the horror of the situation. We ran out of the garden, slammed the door, and stood there, breathing heavily. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm down. The horrifying images we had seen wouldn't leave my mind. After catching our breath, we decided to continue searching. I was already a bit afraid to open the next door, but I noticed it was slightly ajar. This was something new. I knocked and entered. Inside, I saw Bluebeard's wife sitting by a mirror, brushing her hair. I went inside to make sure our door wasn't there, but I found nothing. As I was about to leave, I remembered there must be a room that Bluebeard mentioned. Apparently, our door was there. I decided to take a risk and asked the woman, "Excuse me, could you help us and show us the door your husband forbade you to enter?" Hearing these words, she stopped brushing, and setting the brush aside, turned to look at me. She got up slowly and walked past us to the exit. We exchanged surprised glances and followed her. The woman led us through the castle corridors. We followed her, feeling the fear growing inside us again. The walls seemed darker and more menacing, and the torches cast long shadows that seemed alive. She led us to a staircase descending to the basement. The staircase was narrow and steep, and each step echoed against the stone walls. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy and musty. We passed through several low arches and narrow passages until we reached a massive door. The door was made of dark wood, adorned with rusty metal fittings. Engraved on it were gruesome scenes of executions and torture, making the blood freeze in our veins. The lock was large and heavy, clearly securing what lay behind the door. Bluebeard's wife said nothing more. She just stood silently by the door, looking at us with her empty eyes. She seemed like a ghost, left here to show us the way to this dark and sinister corner of the castle. Sarah looked at me and whispered, "We have to open it." I nodded, took out the bunch of keys, and began sorting through them, trying to find the right one. Finally, one of the keys fit. I inserted it into the lock, and it clicked. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the tension build with each passing second. Before leaving, I looked around, expecting Bluebeard to attack us, but the basement was silent. We decided to go in, and Bluebeard's wife entered with us. I had a feeling we needed to lock the door behind us, so I did. The room was lit by torches, although I didn't know who had lit them. Inside was a real torture chamber. In the corner stood burning cauldrons with steam rising from them. Along the walls hung various axes, heated iron rods, and other torture instruments. Tubs of water, where he probably drowned people, lined the wall. Bloodstains covered the floor and walls, creating an atmosphere of horror and hopelessness. We were horrified as we searched the room, trying to find clues to the location of the red door, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, a ghost of a woman materialized on one of the devices. She began to scream terribly, her shriek so loud I covered my ears with my hands. She screamed and screamed until her voice gave out and she started gasping. We were afraid that the scream might attract people or even Bluebeard himself. I looked at Sarah, whose face was pale, and said, "Let's check everything. Move the handles. Maybe there's a hidden door." We began searching for a secret mechanism, touching everything we could find. Suddenly, another ghost of a girl appeared. She was tied to a torture device from which boiling water was pouring. It was the same girl I had seen earlier in the kitchen. She screamed horribly, making our search difficult. Eventually, she also lost her voice. I started to understand why they couldn't scream when we saw them earlier. We continued our search, and then we heard a furious roar outside the door. Bluebeard had returned, cursing us and promising to kill us as well as his wife. He began pounding on the door with something heavy, probably an axe, breaking it with each blow. "Hurry up!" I shouted, and started yanking at everything in sight. My eyes fell on a large painting hanging on the center of the wall, depicting Bluebeard holding the heads of women who were screaming in terror. This is it, I thought. The size matched a door. I ran to the painting and examined the gap between it and the wall. Finding a small indentation, I began to pull at it. The painting started to give way. "Help me!" I shouted to the others. We started pulling the painting together when we suddenly heard the sound of breaking wood. I turned to see that Bluebeard had managed to break a hole in the door. Pulling out his axe, he peered inside and, seeing our attempts, roared even more furiously, starting to chop at the door with even more vigor. We kept pulling, but it was tough. Suddenly, I noticed something on the floor that looked like a crowbar. I ran over and picked it up, using it as a lever. The painting began to give way more easily and almost opened. At that moment, there was a crash and the door was broken through. "Faster!" I yelled, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I pressed the lever and the painting moved away from the wall, falling to the floor. In front of us was a red door with the number 3 on it. I began sorting through the bunch of keys when I heard Sarah shout, "Get down!" I dropped to the floor just as something whizzed over my head and crashed into the door with a thud. Looking up, I realized it was an axe, buried halfway into the wood. Turning around, I saw Bluebeard grab a massive sickle and start advancing toward us. We had little time. I quickly found the right key and inserted it into the lock. There was a familiar click, and the door opened inward, revealing a burst of bright white light. "Jump!" I yelled at Sarah, and she dove through the doorway, urging me not to delay. Tom decided to play the hero and stepped forward to face Bluebeard, holding a spear. I couldn't leave him. Bluebeard charged at us, growling furiously. But suddenly his wife stood before him and began to scream hysterically, blood tears streaming from her eyes. He halted, raised his hand, and chopped off her head with the sickle. This moment saved us, giving us a bit more time. I grabbed Tom by the scruff and dragged him through the doorway. A bright flash of light blinded us, and I lost consciousness again. I woke to the sound of thunder and realized I was lying on cold, wet ground. Struggling to stand, I looked around for my companions. In the distance, I saw Sarah and Thomas arguing near 3 doors. Looking around again, I realized we were on a huge rock surrounded by a raging sea. The water crashed against the rocks with such force that it seemed like the ground was shaking. The sea was black, with white caps of waves breaking against the stones, creating a myriad of spray. The air smelled of salt and ozone. Dark clouds hung low over us, making the scene even more ominous. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating our island with brief flashes of light. In the middle of the island stood 3 doors in door frames, black, white, and yellow. They led nowhere. They were just 3 doors of different colors, set right on the ground, like portals to the unknown. I decided to approach my companions and listen to what they were arguing about. "What's the matter?" I asked. Sarah, with an angry face, said, "There are 3 doors, and one leads home. Thomas is sure we should choose the black door. I think we should first confer and look for clues outside." "We should look for clues inside the door," Thomas insisted. We stood at the edge of the island, feeling the sea wind pierce our clothes. The waves roared, and storm clouds loomed over us, creating an atmosphere of unease and uncertainty. "For now, let's look around and then decide whether to enter the doors or not," I suggested. Everyone agreed, and we started walking around the area. But apart from rocks and the raging sea, there was nothing here. Returning to the 3 doors, we decided to open each one and see what was inside. Opening the white door, we were bathed in a familiar white light. Opening the yellow door, the light was yellow. Behind the black door was only impenetrable darkness. It was impossible to see what was inside. We had to decide. We voted. Tom was for the black door, Sarah for the white. My vote was the deciding one. "Why are you so insistent on the black door?" I asked Tom. "I have a gut feeling," he replied. "Not a very strong argument," I noted. Sarah said it was better to choose the white door because it wasn't as scary, and we had previously traveled through white light. A stronger argument, but it could still be a trap. Realizing we had no other choice but to rely on luck, I decided to draw lots. Finding 3 straws, I said if you draw the short one, it will be your choice. If I win, we go through the yellow door. Tom was first and immediately drew the short one. What luck. Sarah frowned, but then looked closely at Tom. "All right, let's go with your choice," she said. We opened the door and saw a black portal. Tom stepped through first, and I followed him. This time I didn't lose consciousness, but felt like I had just passed through a black curtain. We found ourselves in an alley surrounded by hedges. It was like a maze. The passages were narrow, just enough for two people to walk side by side. Tom led the way, I followed him, and Sarah brought up the rear. The hedges were dense and high, about 2 meters tall. They were green but appeared sinister in the dim light filtering through rare breaks in the clouds. The passages were winding, and each turn could bring hope or danger. We slowly walked down the alley, trying to remember every turn. The air was damp and cold, like the breath of the maze itself. We moved forward, hearing only our footsteps and the rustling of leaves. Sometimes it seemed like we heard distant voices or whispers, but it could have just been the wind. Suddenly, Tom stopped and pointed at the ground. There might be a trap here. I looked where he pointed, but didn't see anything. "Do you have a phone?" Sarah suddenly asked Tom. "Shine a light on the trap with the flashlight." Tom was surprised. "What do you mean, shine a light? Can a phone do that?" Sarah pulled her smartphone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight. "Here, look," she said, approaching him. At that moment, Tom got distracted, and Sarah suddenly pushed him forward. Tom fell into the spot where he had said there was a trap, and the ground gave way beneath him. He fell into a pit about 15 or 16 feet deep. It was quite deep, but the most horrifying thing was that at the bottom were long iron spikes, which pierced him through. One stuck out of his chest, others from his arms and legs. His head was untouched. I turned to Sarah and screamed, "Are you crazy?" But she just smirked and said, "Look, there's no blood." I looked down and saw she was right. Tom, though impaled on the spikes, hadn't lost consciousness. There was indeed no blood. Suddenly, Tom smiled grotesquely, a smile I had never seen on him before. He asked Sarah, "When did you figure it out?" Sarah replied, "When you said where you were from. You said you were from North Tarrytown, but I know that place well because I've been there several times. It's called Sleepy Hollow now. It was renamed back in 1996. Actually, it's quite well known, so I immediately realized something was off about you. Besides, your clothes seemed a bit old-fashioned." After she said this, I also remembered thinking his clothes were a bit old-fashioned, but fashion tends to come back, so I didn't pay much attention to it. Sarah continued, "I kept an eye on you the whole time, waiting for some trap, but you behaved quietly and didn't arouse suspicion. But when we got to this island, you suddenly insisted on going through the black door. That's when I knew something was wrong. The final test was the phone. You didn't know the most basic things that any modern person knows. That was the last straw." Tom listened silently, then said, "Yes, you're indeed smart. When you mentioned the phone, I suspected you a bit, but still let my guard down." Sarah asked, "But who are you?" Tom laughed and suddenly started changing. His skin tore, as did his clothes, and in his place appeared the huge creature we had seen earlier. It was the same werewolf that stayed in the first door. Sarah covered her mouth in fear and whispered, "But you stayed in the first dimension." The wolf grinned eerily and said, "Who said there was only one of us? There were always two. My brother stayed there. I once ate a man named Tom, took his form, and waited for new arrivals. You weren't around for a long time, but here you are, and you fell into my trap. Yes. Unfortunately, one small detail gave me away." "But how did you move between dimensions?" I asked. The wolf laughed again. It sounded like an old engine rumbling. "You helped me yourself. I strained my memory and recalled the moment. I had pushed him through the first door and pulled him into the second. I smacked my forehead. We can't pass through the door on our own unless helped by an outsider. It was quite an amusing adventure, said the werewolf. He began to rise, the spikes unable to hold him back. He stood up and continued, "Thank you for helping me, but now it's time to eat." Sarah grabbed my hand, and we ran. Damn, how did we fall into such a trap? The wolf followed us, and his heavy steps echoed behind us. We remembered the way back and soon reached the door we had left open. We rushed through it and closed it behind us, buying us some time as the wolf crashed into it. We were back on the island, breathing heavily as I looked around. We needed to choose which door to enter. Our lives depended on it. Then I suddenly remembered my father's message. At the end of the letter, after the words "survive," he had written, "And remember, it must be yellow." Now I understood what he meant. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran to the yellow door. As we crossed it, I heard a roar outside and realized the werewolf had gotten free. Hopefully he hadn't noticed us and would check the white door first, giving us some time. We found ourselves in front of a small house in the forest. The house looked old and abandoned, with a roof covered in thick moss, and the windows were dirty and broken. The house exuded neglect and abandonment, as if it had stood there for decades without seeing human presence. We ran to the house, opened the front door, which creaked loudly, and dashed inside. The air inside was heavy and musty, as if the house had stopped breathing long ago. We started running through the rooms, checking each door in search of the right one. Each room was chaotic. Old, broken furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and the walls were cracked and stained with mold. The floors creaked and sagged underfoot, creating the feeling that you might fall into an abyss at any moment. Outside, the werewolf roared. He had found us. The roar was so loud and frightening that it seemed the walls of the house shook from its force. We hurried and started checking doors even faster, going room by room. Each new room brought new horrors. In one, we saw an old rocking chair slowly rocking by itself. In another, mirrors covered with mold reflected our fear and despair. We knew we had little time, and that the right choice would mean our survival. With each second, the tension grew and our hearts beat in unison with our steps. We checked cupboards and chests, hoping to find some clue. In one corner of a room, I noticed an old chest emitting a faint light. I opened it and found a key, but then the werewolf roared again, now very close. Suddenly we heard a strange sound from the ceiling, as if something heavy was scraping along the wooden beams, like an unknown creature making its way to us. However, we didn't stop. We heard the front door being broken down. There was a crash, and the werewolf appeared in the doorway. His eyes glowed in the dim light, and cold steam rose from his breath, mixing with the musty air of the old house. We started running, grabbing everything we could, chairs, lamps, old books, and throwing them at him. The werewolf just laughed, a grotesque sound that echoed through the house. It seemed that our efforts only amused him, and his laughter grew louder and more sinister. The werewolf leaped at us, but suddenly, a horrifying creature, resembling a witch with numerous tentacles writhing and grasping everything around, attacked it. Her face was shrouded in shadow, but her eyes glowed green, and inhuman sounds, a mix of screams and hissing, came from her mouth. The tentacles wrapped around the werewolf, and they began a brutal fight, biting and tearing at each other. Bloody splatters flew across the room, and the walls started shaking from their furious struggle. It seemed this monster of the dimension wasn't happy with the intruder. We seized the moment and continued searching for an exit. In one of the rooms, we saw a red door on the ceiling. Sarah whispered, "That's it. We found it." But how could we get up there? We started looking for a ladder, rummaging through everything around. The shadows in the room seemed alive, as if ghosts were watching us. Dust rose under our feet, creating ghostly figures in the air. Unable to find a ladder, we decided to build a makeshift pile from furniture. We began stacking pieces on top of each other, starting with an old table, then several chairs, and a chest of drawers. Each piece of furniture creaked and wobbled, but we had no other choice. We quickly assembled this makeshift ladder, climbing up as the items beneath us threatened to collapse. I grabbed the key and inserted it into the lock of the door on the ceiling. The lock clicked, and the door opened inward, flashing white light. I helped Sarah, and she was immediately sucked in by an unknown force. Then I grabbed the edge of the opening and began to pull myself up. Suddenly, the wolf grabbed me. My heart sank with despair as I felt its claws digging into my leg. Thoughts raced through my mind. This is the end. I won't be able to escape. The wolf was pulling me down, and I was nearly out of strength when it suddenly let go. I turned and saw that another monster had saved me. It had once again engaged in battle with the wolf, giving me a chance to escape. Gathering my last bit of strength, I pulled myself up, and finally, the unknown force lifted me and sucked me through the doorway, leaving behind the roars and sounds of battle. Suddenly, I found myself back in my apartment. I stood in the middle of the room, still wearing the clothes from the second dimension. So, it wasn't a dream. Relief mixed with confusion and fear from the horror I had just experienced. I started walking around the apartment and noticed a layer of dust on the furniture and a wilted flower in the pot. It seemed I had been gone for a while. Looking out the window, I saw snow covering everything outside. The world was white and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just been through. Turning on the computer, I saw the date on the screen, December 24th. I remembered that it was Sarah's birthday. Exactly, Sarah. I didn't know her number or other contact details, only that she lived in New York. I felt a wave of sadness and loneliness wash over me. I lay down on the bed, trying to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, I put my hand in my pocket and felt a piece of paper. It was a phone number. My heart started beating faster, overwhelmed with joy. Getting up, I hurried to the phone and dialed the number. The ringing seemed to last an eternity. "Hello?" I finally heard a familiar voice on the other end.